Hello and welcome to today's session of the Supply Chain Master Series presented by Transportation Insight. I'm Peter Ryan in the Transportation Insight Marketing Group. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this digital event. Our panelists are ready to deliver impactful insight that you can apply into your own operational environment. We designed this series of digital events to connect you directly with our team of supply chain masters to bring you expert level advice on solving supply chain challenges. To that end, if you have a question during today's session, simply type it into the questions panel that you see in your webinar viewer. We'll respond to as many questions as possible during our broadcast. Well, let's jump right into today's topic being presented by Client Solutions Directors Mike Anderson and Scott Vazana. Thank you, Mike and Scott, for being with us today. Mike, can we
Oh,
hear you?
hello. Yeah, a little technical glitch there. Thank you.
That's all right. That's quite all right.
Appreciate that. So let me just reiterate very quickly. Like myself, Scott is a client solutions director on the Transportation Insight team. He has an extensive background in the industry and has held positions in multimodal operations, aircraft management, and even flew several years as a corporate pilot. His most recent tenure was with a group founded by the late T. Boone Pickens, where he served as their senior business development manager, selling services to transportation operators for 10 successful years. Scott holds degrees in both transportation management and transportation safety, and we are both looking forward to presenting for you today.
Well, hello everyone, and thanks, Mike. I'm proud to have the pleasure of introducing my friend, colleague, and our wily veteran of our duo, Mike Anderson. He comes to us with over 20 years of experience in the transportation world. He founded and operated and later sold a successful transportation group focused on LTL, import, drayage, transloading, and rail. Since then, he has been solving complex logistical challenges for customers specializing in 3PL, 4PL, import, export, and food manufacturing activities. I'd say the only thing Mike can't do is juggle, but I'm not positive about that. With that, I'd like to hand it back over to you, Mike, so you can tell our listeners where this webinar journey is headed.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. And again, thanks for everybody attending today. And so we're going to talk about today's topics. Really, we're talking about the bullwhip effect. To get started down that path, we want to get on the same page for basically a description of what a supply chain is. I'm not going to go into real great depth about it, and we're going to talk a little bit later and display a simplified supply chain just for purposes of demonstration of the bullwhip effect. We're going to define the bullwhip effect for you. We're going to talk about how did we get here, why are we suffering from it, countermeasures and solutions that you can employ, and then how to employ those in executing into the future to weaken the effect of the bullwhip effect. All right. So as we think about supply chains, typically nowadays it's more of a supply web. For purposes today, we're going to stick with kind of a linear understanding of a supply chain. Each node in that chain is one actor for our demonstration today. But when you think about modern day supply chains or supply webs, it's important to understand, especially as you're trying to understand what the bullwhip effect is. It's at the end of the day, it's a systemically caused problem of communication between all the various partners within a supply web. So it's not the one or two times that people are talking to one another, it's the multitude of communications over a vast network or supply web that each individual person in a traditional supply chain is now faced with. So it's an extraordinarily complicated subject. We're going to try and well, it's not that complicated. It's pretty complicated. We're going to try and make it as easy as possible to understand. But don't think for a minute that the bullwhip effect only really applies to linear supply chains is really the point of this slide. Okay. So moving on really to talk about the bullwhip effect itself, and it needs a little bit of definition. So back in 1961, a guy out of MIT, Forrester, he was a farm boy, and he was a brilliant electrical engineer and got an MIT directly after high school. And he did lots of great things, including helping invent in 1956 that SAG or SAGE air defense system. But then as he was moving through his career there, he started to get more interested in issues related to management and how systems work together. And he further got the opportunity to really dig into that when GE offered a grant of $10 million and he went on board with GE and started to study some issues that they were having with some of their production facilities, especially in Kansas City as it related to a home appliance production facility. And what he noticed is that sometimes the workforce would be completely idle, and in other times they'd be working 2 or 3 shifts a day. And it wasn't always tied to customer demand. And so he started to try and understand why that was, and he became the father of system dynamics and really started to try and understand where the problem lie in the disconnect between consumer buying habits and the order process throughout the organization. And it really comes down to one of communication. Then a guy named Dr. Lee from Stanford further refined that, focusing exclusively on supply chain when he was put on contract with Procter & Gamble, trying to understand the problem that Procter & Gamble was experiencing with diapers. So they would see the orders that they received from the Walmart and Targets of the world were much different than what the consumer was actually buying. So as we'll see, we're further going to talk about that, but Forrester was able to display that a 10% change in the rate of sale at the retail level can result in up to a 40% change in demand for the manufacturer, right? So remedy for this effect is to understand the system as a whole and to make modifications in behavioral practice. So it's not a problem of people making bad decisions, it's individuals making good decisions with the information that they have at the time, okay? And so Scott's gonna well, we're gonna actually, before we do that, I wanna jump in and give an illustration of this to maybe just make it a little simpler for everybody to understand. If you don't mind giving me control of that screen there, Peter. Oh yeah, look at you. Let me just move this on over here real quick, and I think this will just make it a little bit easier for everybody to understand. So in our simplified supply chain here, you'll see factory, distributor, wholesaler, retailer, and customer. And the customer and the retailer are closely aligned, as you'll see. When the customer buys something, the retailer reacts in a pretty rational way because they're so close to the information, okay? But as it moves up through the supply chain, in our simple example, you'll see wide variation. And you could see that better. Actually, let's capture it all here. You can see that better if we just insert a simple graph. And really, this is a good one here, I think, yeah. So what you see here is this 40% difference that Forrester described in his study over at GE. So you see in this line, that's the customer buying behavior. A slight change creates a rational slight change, and then the wheels fall off the cart in terms of communication. So what's happening through the supply chain at the wholesaler, distributor, and factory level is that they are rounding up, making decisions with the information that they have, or rounding down. So what you're going to end up with is a bunch of inventory on the shelves for products that people don't want to buy, and nothing available on the shelves for products that people want to buy. Obviously, in COVID times, the big example is toilet paper. So that was a direct reflection, or that was the bullwhip effect in real time happening. So
Hey, Mike, not to interrupt, but
yeah, go ahead, buddy.
I think it is worth reiterating that fact that you stated there, that a 10% change either at the beginning or end of the chain does account for a 40% fluctuation in the middle, and this graphic really demonstrates that on both sides, in the table and the graph.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting too, is that the overreaction happens in a positive sense, for lack of a better word, and in a negative sense. And you see the person who suffers typically most is at the factory level, simply because they're the furthest away from the information that is necessary to make better decisions, right? So they're not making poor decisions because they're not good at their job. They just, again, don't have the right information. So that, I think, is an incredible demonstration very quickly of what the bullwhip effect shows in real time, and backs Forrester up, obviously. All right, so you're back in control there, my friend. All right, so now that we've gone through the graph piece, I'm gonna maybe ask Scott to step in and talk a little bit about who's susceptible to the bullwhip effect.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Mike. And
Sure.
unfortunately, the short answer to that question is virtually every business must address or at least be aware of the bullwhip effect and where it comes from and what it does. So hopefully we'll help you with that today in this webinar. But um, really, the only scenario that we could really come up with that you would not or would have minimal impact of the bullwhip effect would be companies that are vertically integrated, where you're insulated from those outside forces. But the catch with that is that a vertically integrated company definitely has its own challenges. So I'm not sure that you come out ahead in that, but really that was the only one. So bottom line, if you're a node in the supply chain, you're going to be susceptible to the bullwhip effect. And Mike has mentioned Procter and Gamble and Walmart. Walmart being the largest employer on the planet, as we all know, they would be considered a leader in taming this issue. But they spend a whole lot of resources and have a whole lot of resources to throw at this thing. So, but they do know that customer satisfaction will suffer, and ultimately profitability will suffer if they don't address it. So, definitely one that gets their attention, and they have been one of the leaders at solving. Again, Procter and Gamble, Mike has mentioned, they were really the pioneers, but Procter and Gamble had been operating quite a while themselves without even identifying the bullwhip effect, and it finally came to light. So, the point I'm making there is some of the folks on this webinar probably operate their own business, but do you have the resources and the capability to not only recognize but start to solve or help yourself with the ramifications of the bullwhip effect? And then while we're on the topic of successful companies, let's talk about an industry that's near and dear to my heart with my history, is the oil and gas industry. They are definitely subject to constant fluctuations in the supply and demand arena, and they're always challenged with that. And if you recall, about 6 months ago, with the floating armada of oil tankers off the coast of California, that was a gross example of what happens when you get the supply chain or the supply and demand aspect wrong. If you recall, oil went negative, one of the few times in history that's happened. And just a good visual example, not good, but definitely a visual that you could see when supply chain does go wrong. So, hopefully Mike and I haven't scared you or confused you too much by this point. That's not the intent. We're definitely going to leave you with some solutions and ways to recognize the bullwhip effect and when it's happening to you and how to head it off. But for now, I think we're going to kick it back over to Mike, and he's going to continue the conversation.
Yeah, Scott, you said something interesting there about movement, and really the bullwhip effect, as named by Dr. Lee out of Stanford when he was working with Procter and Gamble. He came up with the idea of the bullwhip because it is a slight movement or slight variation in customer ordering patterns that cause this wide fluctuation, both high and low, right? So if you think about a bullwhip or the handle of a bullwhip, it takes just a slight flick to create a huge wave pattern through the length of the bullwhip. And so that was the analogy that he used to really kind of help people visualize this effect throughout the supply.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Pampers diapers was really the catalyst for them to say, hey, we've got an issue out there. What is it? What's going on? And not to be too too graphic, but babies consistently go to the bathroom probably about the same amount, and they knew that diapers were not a product that should fluctuate dramatically like a seasonal product or something like that. So that's kind of what led them in that direction. So
yeah, and Walmart, Target, they were just it was a fairly stable buying pattern, but still we were seeing decisions made, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. See decisions made that they had big production issues. And so as we think about really the ill effects of what the bullwhip can bring, Procter & Gamble suffered from it. And they suffered in ways like extra capacity to meet the high variable demand, So we moved on to why should I care? Capacity is underutilized when that demand drops, right? Unit labor costs can rise in periods of low demand, overtime, temporary labor, some subcontract spend. You know, your spend rises in periods of high demand. That's artificial high demand. And variable demand also increases lead times, causing excess inventory, right? So when Forrester was thinking about this, he was thinking about a stochastic problem, which is really just a fancy word for irrational variability, right? So extreme variability that is difficult to understand where that variability comes from, right? So thus the Bullwhip effect really can be very expensive. Companies invest in extra capacity, extra inventory, extra workers, paying workers not to work, bringing on different shifts for artificial high demand, inflated inventory carrying cost, and again, the shelves with products that aren't selling are full. So that's one of the ill effects, the major ill effects. And we're going to talk a little bit now about the major causes beyond what we've seen with COVID. And there's ways to think about that and communicate that, even natural or natural disasters, I guess, in terms of the pandemic and any other major disrupt. There's even ways to deal with that. But we're really going to describe today kind of the normal, not normal, but the usual ways that people think about the bullwhip effect and the 5 categories that typically help cause it or accelerate that effect. So one is the order batching. So as you see, as it moves up the supply web to the factory, each member past that retailer, right, the wholesaler, the distributor, the factory, they're making rounding errors, and we'll call it rounding errors, right? So they're going to round up or they're going to round down. And as they make those decisions based upon the best information that they have, their intuition, their understanding of history, they're going to round up or round down, and that further accentuates the bullwhip effect as their order moves up the supply web, right? The next is price fluctuations. So there's a reason why Walmart does everyday low prices, right? It's great for the consumer, helps them understand that that price is as low as it can be and will typically be stable, but it's also a brilliant move on their part to eliminate the problems associated with price fluctuations as it exists in typical supply webs. That's helped them create a more known supply web, if you will. So orders are more consistent all the way up through the entire web, right? So special discounts, other cost changes can regularly disturb buying patterns. So you think about somebody doing within an individual organization, you could have the sales or marketing department put out a promotion, not really talk to the production folks or their upstream partners, right? And so you'll see even within organizations that they're causing their own bullwhip, regardless of the individuals in the supply web themselves, right? So demand information, really what we're talking about is past data misses the fluctuations. Most everybody uses past to really prepare for the present and for the future in terms of inventory. So you're going to get caught flat-footed when you see these other factors that we're talking about come into play, or you get some kind of natural disaster. And really the key here is as close to the customer information that you can get as real time as you can get it is crucial moving forward, right? So the lack of communication between each link in the supply chain, it gets difficult for processes to run efficiently. So for example, I wrote here, managers can identify a product demand quite differently within different links of the supply chain and therefore order different quantities. So that's where you see that rounding error come in. And finally, it's about goal alignment. So again, back to the marketing department or the other pieces of the operation. And free returns, believe it or not, free returns is kind of a major source of cause of the bullwhip effect. Sometimes customers may purposely overstate demands due to shortages and then cancel when the supply becomes adequate again, right? So without return, forfeit retailers will continue to exaggerate their needs and cancel orders. So it's not necessarily the returns from the customer, it's returns from other players further up the supply web, right? So I think that kind of covers the major effects of the bullwhip, okay? And so I'm going to kind of move on to the next section of this, which is really about how we're going to counter this. And so Scott's going to help us understand a little bit more about how we can come up with ways to counter the bullwhip effect.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So again, it's not all doom and gloom. There definitely are some ways to mitigate your risk exposure to the bullwhip effect, and we've both touched on it just slightly. But really, the main takeaway, and I'm going to start with dessert here. I want you guys to really take this away. If you take one thing away from the webinar today, it's probably this, and that is the most important thing: is the communication and data sharing is of the utmost importance to mitigate the bullwhip effect. Again, this is what Walmart has done. They've really opened up those lines of communications. They've allowed vendor managed inventory to access, suppliers get to access Walmart's inventory data. And this is really what makes the difference and what has made the greatest positive impact for Walmart. They've opened those channels above and below them. Now, we're asking you to do that too, or at least think about doing that, whether it's provide the data directly or the communication alone. But if you can share the data, that would be the way to do it. That is often considered proprietary data, so it's not often the easiest thing to do. But one solution to that is to potentially bring in a third party like Transportation Insight that understands and knows both sides of the business and can advocate for the change. So you have to be able to demonstrate and articulate how each node will benefit. The old adage, what's in it for me, definitely applies here, because that's what people want to know. If I give you my data, what do I get out of it? So what they get is a consistent and solid supply chain and solid pricing ultimately in the end. So again, data sharing, open lines of communication, first and foremost. And then look within your own organization. Do your order levels meet your actual needs? Are your contingencies being added along the way, and at what points? It's possible within your own walls, you're starting the bullwhip effect. You may be the guilty one. So look at your own resource or your own personnel, because that will be the actual easiest one to take a look at and at least clean that up first. That's a good place to start. Another is to utilize simulations. I like to call them the war games of your supply chain. You can run simulations using your historical data, use your own data, use your own locations, use hypothetical scenarios. But, if you pull up your historical data, look at if you had made different decisions during those times, how would that have affected the outcome? Would you have potentially performed better? The Navy is a great example here. I don't know if anyone saw in the news about a month ago, but every 2 years they have what's called RIMPAC. It's an event where 25 countries send their navies in and they play war games. So the Navy is arguably one of the most organized and well-run organizations in the world, according to a lot of people, and they run simulations. So, Mike, I believe you had an example too of a simulation that you've used in the past.
Yeah, that brought to mind a couple of things. There's a guy named Stearman who helped to create it. He was also an MIT guy, and he worked with Forrester and some others, David Brown, I think. And he came up with something called the beer game, right? So the beer game, and if anybody's really interested in it, we've played it here, and it really is eye-opening. And what the beer game in essence just brings different people together, and they take on a role as a person within that simple supply chain that we described, and they can only react to the information they're given from their customer, right, regardless of who that is within that supply chain. So we saw very, very, very quickly human behavior is, and you can play it over and over again, and it's always the same result. People will round up, people make decisions based on intuition. They've got to guess, they got to play cagey, and it really becomes a story of how do I react in a way to second guess 2 or 3 members up or down that supply web. So it's really eye-opening. It's called the Beer Game by Stearman. I think that those who have not played that game will get a lot out of it. And I also wanted to mention really quickly too on this, what can you do? In working with a couple of new clients that recently came on board of mine, their excitement at at Insight Fusion and our ability now to provide them with real-time data along with historical data, and to be able to drill down in this graphic dashboard of every possible variable that you need to capture within your network, your transportation network, including SKU profitability, some discussion about margin management. That's a fairly sophisticated use of it, but you can really start to understand what your order profiles look like, start to understand what you should actually be charging for transportation to a given region based upon different criteria. So that's a very exciting, relatively new product coming out of Transportation Insight that a lot of my customers are very excited about, just the amount of business intelligence and actionable intelligence they can use off of that. So I just thought I got excited about that, so I thought I'd mention that.
Yep, definitely worth a mention. Mike, you talk about beer, I talk about the Navy. Makes sense.
Perfect.
Right. So moving on, another way to mitigate the bullwhip effect is to research alternate sources. Consider onshoring versus offshoring. Maybe this is a time to look at that. Don't leave yourself at the mercy of one supplier. As Mike mentioned, we're parts of a supply web. So make your web bigger, make it stronger, and look for alternate sources. And then back to the data aspect. I know we're talking a lot about data, but we love data at Transportation Insight. I can guarantee you that. We often say, "In God we trust, all others use data," and that couldn't be any more true. We really get excited about it, and we often see our clients, they have data, they have no idea what to do with it. They have it coming in from channel after channel. A lot of the time it ends up on the shelf with no real intent or purpose. So that's where a group like Transportation Insight comes in and looks at that historical data. How are you gathering it, and what could we do with it for you? That can be generated into usable business intelligence, and that's what Transportation Insight was founded on ultimately 20 years ago. It matters, it works, and as Mike mentioned, our Insight Fusion program really gathers that data into a dashboard that you can use. It's at your fingertips, web-based. Not to make it a commercial, but it's definitely worth a mention. It's a neat product, and we'd be happy to show you that after the webinar if you'd like to contact us. But not to sound too cliche, but your historical data can really open and give you the keys to the future, and it's true. So don't let history repeat itself. Use what you have at your fingertips. So and Mike had mentioned a little bit about the ability to quantify your promotions policies and procedures and how they affect your operations. Your marketing department decides it's time for a sale. That's great. But do you really know what that means to your operation overall? Does it ultimately mean profit in the end? There's a common rule of thumb in the e-commerce world that 20% of the products account for 80% of the profit, which is great. But if you're flying blind without systems in place, you're running a very high risk of damaging your profitability. So, go ahead, Mike. You want to add
No,
something?
sorry. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Okay, yeah, you touched on that earlier, but very important, and of course the everyday low price model, as you mentioned with Walmart and others, really promotes. That's the key to promoting a consistent and a steady supply chain. Now, you may be saying, well, I'm not the one who has to deal with it, but you do in the end, because if your supplier is not happy, it can affect you. It can raise your rates, it can raise your prices, it can damage your customer satisfaction levels. So definitely you have to take it into consideration and ultimately see what your margins look like all the way through. So you have to have that visibility through all aspects of your supply chain and transportation programs. So another thing that Mike had mentioned was batch orders, and what I'm going to tell you is to limit the number of batch orders. But transportation may seem cheaper, or warehousing may seem cheaper than transportation in times. But again, those batch orders, when you do that, it places a burden on your supplier, and again puts them in a position where they're the ones flying blind in this case. So if you want to help yourself, help others, and help them be consistent. And then last but definitely not least, and this is probably a grossly oversimplified statement, but clean up your transportation program, because it definitely can affect the bottom line. While it's not an exact node in the supply chain, it's definitely a part of each one of them. So it may have potential to amplify the bullwhip effect in each case. So it may be even worse than just a node being out of calibration. So, you know, transportation continues to be a factor in the supply chain that can make a difference. Whether you have that as a positive impact or negative impact is really depends on how you approach it. But, you know, carrier procurement, network alignment, technology, audit, data capture, and are really all the keys to cleaning up your transportation process. So it's definitely not a small and easy feat. Transportation, you know, that's another one of our core competencies, and that's what we were founded on, is an enterprise solution that includes all of those aspects. And it really takes all of those aspects to put yourself on that continuous improvement cycle. Mike, did you have anything to add?
Well, you know, I was just thinking about the importance of everything you just said and how important the overarching theme here, which is information and communication, right? So one definition of nirvana or heaven is perfect information, right? Perfect understanding and perfect information. The closer you can get to understanding both real-time and historical information as it relates to both up and downstream of that supply web or supply chain, the better decisions you're going to be able to make. Now, there's ways to ameliorate that we just talked about today or weaken that effect. There's a couple things on the horizon that maybe are, you know, they're problematic in certain ways, but that will help make that information more available, at least be able to gather that information with the Internet of Things, right? And combined with a blockchain technology, as the amount of sensors get out there, we're really going to start to understand, you know, to the SKU level movement of product through a supply chain all the way into a customer's hands. We're not there yet, but we can help get there with the combination of processes that we bring to the table to optimize those networks. And the key to all of that is our ability to help folks with information. So I just wanted to add that real quick. So thanks,
Yeah,
Scott. I appreciate that.
good point. I mean, leaning your supply chain, leaning your transportation programs. It's not just leaning your manufacturing process anymore to establish that margin management piece of your business. It has to include everything. If you really want to do it right, you know, your profits may be great enough where you can have a leak, but what's the point? Why not be the best you can if you're gonna try?
Yeah, but you can see why people get excited, right? So they get this giant order from somebody in their supply web, and they're like, you know, look how much we're going to sell this quarter. You know, like the cult of sales just overshadows stuff sometimes. It takes thoughtful managers and thoughtful operators to really try to dig in on that and try and understand really what that means, both for their partners and for their customers. So yeah, it's kind of a 360-degree view of it. So anyway.
Well, absolutely. Well, and that's a good segue into our last slide. And that's who solves this issue. So really the question is, do you solve it or does somebody else solve it? If you've been following Transportation Insights Expert Lens series, one of our previous webinars was about just that. It was about insources versus outsources, your outsourcing your supply chain and transportation activities. And they made some great points in that webinar. And one is, do you have the resources? Do you have the knowledge? Is it one of your core competencies? And if it's not, if the answer is no to one or any of those, it's really consideration should be given to bringing on a third party to help you with that process. And stick with what you're really good at and what your company was founded on. So, you know, the supply chain and transportation world is what Transportation Insight lives in. And we have the team, the tools, and the technology to help our customers master their supply chain. And so that really concludes the webinar. Mike, if you have anything to add, now's the time. Otherwise, I'll kick it back over to Peter, and we can take a few questions if we have a few moments.
Sounds great, Scott. Appreciate that. Great job.
Okay, guys, we do have, thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. And as a reminder to the audience, don't hesitate to enter your questions in that questions panel you see there on the screen. We'll address as many as we have time for. The first one that came in is, I'm going to throw it to you, Scott. You mentioned the need. Well, both of you actually talked about batch ordering a little bit, but Scott, I'd like you to answer this one for us.
Okay.
You mentioned the need to avoid batch ordering, but this listener says, for us, warehousing is less costly than transportation. So are you saying is to avoid it, even if it is a less expensive option?
Fair question. And there are cases where batch ordering would make sense. I would say if that is necessary, just be transparent, whether it's above or below yourself in the supply chain about why you're ordering, not necessarily because it's due to some demand that's an outside force. And so that way you're transparent with your suppliers and let them know the reasoning behind that. That's one part that I would say. And the other thing is I'm not going to argue with it, but I would say that bringing the lens over your transportation program probably wouldn't be a bad idea either, just to ensure that transportation is yet less expensive or less costly, because there's a chance if we came in and we found your transportation costs were actually could be lower than warehousing, then you get twice the benefit. So you get your savings on your transportation, and then potentially cut out the warehousing aspect and inventory management. So great question. More complicated than a yes or no for sure.
Thank you, Scott. Next one, I'll throw it over to Mike. So you talked a lot about communication and information. So how does the miscommunication of inventory needs actually happen?
When an order comes across, like in that quick little story I gave about people getting excited about particular sales, it's typically all the information they get from their partner or from their customer or their vendor, right? So when they give it to their vendor, as an example. So they can only react to that. And 8 times out of 10, nobody's going to make that call and ask the question, why are we receiving this large order? It's typically not a question that jumps to people's minds, in my experience anyway. So that issue comes about because of just basic human behavior. They react to that, and if there's any fluctuation that's at all consistent, that's going to, as we saw in the graph, that's going to reverberate all the way through their vendor network as they're seeking those raw materials or whatever supplies they need to bring into a value-added operation or manufacturing facility to put that together to get it on out to the wholesaler or the distributor. So really, it's just not thinking through to get, that's the wrong word, not reacting so quickly and maybe just make that phone call. That's really a basic way to deal with that right away. Why this order so large? Well, geez, we got this giant order from these folks. Maybe people start talking to one another. That's okay for the 1 off, the 2 off, maybe, do that 4 or 5 times, and all of a sudden you're bugging everybody and you're not able to react quickly. And so that's where the system starts to need to evolve, and the system needs to be better informed in terms of that information. So really what you're trying to find is a pathway. Well, identify those pieces of information, then create a pathway for that information to get to those folks that are making those kinds of decisions, so that they can make the thousands of decisions that they have to make on a given day, week, month, or quarter, or year, right? So that's really typically why that happens.
And Mike, I'm gonna take this as an opportunity to reiterate that statistic. 10% change at the beginning accounts for a 40% fluctuation.
Yeah.
It's just, definitely a take
just
away.
People not knowing and not overreacting. They are overreacting or underreacting. It's just they're just making the best decisions they can with the information they have at the time. Yeah.
Right. Not having access to the information they need. Yep. Okay. Thanks, Mike. So this one I'll pose to Scott. So you guys mentioned technology a few times during your talk here. So is there any software available that really solves the bullwhip issue?
Okay. Yeah, the answer is no. And the answer is yes. So there is no specific software, at least that we're aware of, that's dedicated to the bullwhip effect, I would say. However, there are other pieces of software. If all pulled together, Mike mentioned one is Insight Fusion that we offer at Transportation Insight, which is ultimately business intelligence that you could use and take action on. But there are other technology components that feed into that Insight Fusion program. So yes, you have TMS programs, you have audit programs, you have the business intelligence, you have supply chain analytics programs. You know, short of an AI program that doesn't exist yet that I'm aware of, maybe Walmart has it, but I'm sure it would be costly. That would actually run the formula in real time. Uh, you know, it's a topic that I've actually considered, and it's not available. So I guess the answer is there is technology. It has to work in harmony to really provide you with that business intelligence at the end, like our Fusion program does.
Okay. All right. Good. Thanks, Scott. Actually, we had a another question come in from the audience, and I'll throw this out there and let you guys decide who wants to take it. Would it be a correct statement that the bullwhip effect is accentuated by a lead time of supply and non-flexible manufacturing?
Lead time of supply and non-flexible manufacturing.
Yeah.
Lead time. If it's an extended lead time, if you have more time and you ask the right questions, I'm not quite sure. I'd have to really understand the specifics of the interaction, right, to fully answer that question. But
Okay.
it immediately pops into my mind that you have more time to deal with it. What do you think, Scott? And therefore, you're
Yeah.
going to be able to make better decisions because you've got longer lead time. It's always better to have more lead time. And if
Yeah,
you've got
absolutely.
a facility or a manufacturing that is not flexible, then by definition, that's going to eliminate a major cause of the bullwhip, right? So the
Yes.
inflexibility
Right.
will create a stability.
No, it's a great point. Whoever posed that definitely knows a little bit about the bullwhip effect, because yes, those are definitely both contributing factors as well.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, it looks like we're coming up on the time we had allotted for the webinar here. I wanted to thank both of you, Scott and Mike, for sharing your perspectives on this. To our listeners, if you have more questions, please keep filtering them in. We'll get them to Scott and Mike. If you can feel free to connect with Scott and Mike directly if you'd like to learn more. We got their contact information up here on the screen. So be sure to look for our next Supply Chain Master Series event in the resources section of our website. Our next episode is going to be a very interesting one on October 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern. Our panel is going to examine the new never normal that has emerged as a result of the buy online, pick up in store revolution. Whether your business is large or small, the Transportation Insight Supply Chain Solutions can help you control cost, manage risk, and improve your customer experience. So on behalf of our panelists in Transportation Insight, I'd like to thank you for joining today's broadcast. May you master the remainder of your day.